Michael, welcome back.
Great to be back.
I enjoyed the first part of the conversation, and one thing that just jumped out at me was the diversity of ABF, Australian Border Force. And I'd been in law enforcement, so I had an idea what you guys do. But really, when you break it down, there is so much diversity.
Huge amount of diversity in the operational roles, the policy roles, the strategic roles. I mean, really, we got investigators and people can go into intelligence. The career paths that are opening up constantly for our people is fantastic.
Right. You've worked as an investigator at over in London Metro and other areas. What type of work do investigators do with the Australian Border Force? Give me a sort of general thing.
Two kinds of investigation, really, and it reminds me of policing. One under the Customs Act, where we're executing warrants and doing surveillance and those sorts of things, chasing down illicit tobacco precursors, working with the police on narcotics jobs or whatever. And the other one is more complex and longer burn, and they're Migration Act offences, where you've got systemic or serious migration fraud, sometimes being perpetrated by organised crime. But again, we're working with sometimes the AFP, ACIC and others on those investigations. They're the main two kinds of investigations we're going to take, but also Citizenship Act investigations sometimes, those sorts of things.
Does that form into the area of human trafficking?
Sometimes, yeah. Or we do refer, if there's an actual offence identified of human trafficking under Commonwealth legislation, we refer to the AFP.
Yeah.
But our officers are trained to look for the signs. And bear in mind, people who are working in Australia on visas or here on temporary visas, say students, sometimes do find themselves, working in, say, let's take the sex industry.
Yeah.
And being really seriously exploited. Either, the sort of debt bondage, threats against their family in their home country. They sometimes have their passports taken off them. They don't get paid directly. Terrible. And so we've been doing a lot of work very recently over the last few months with the AFP, with the ACIC, and obviously with Department of Home Affairs to really get on top of this sort of problem and the exploitation of not just in the sex industry, but workers in a number of industries.
Yeah. Well, I think it's been publicly talked about the sex industry, but you see people coming, usually young females from poor countries, and they come over here with the promise of education or employment, and they end up in a situation where they're virtually indebted servitude.
Absolutely. And so we've got a few priorities there investigations-wise. One is to make sure we look after the victims of these sorts of crimes. Secondly, we find a lot of the sort of facilitators are the ones we need to go after. So you've got employers, but also these sort of people in the middle, labour hire intermediaries, migration agents. Most of those operators doing the right thing, but some are really quite, evil.
Yeah.
And exploit people for their own criminal gain. And so they're the areas we tend to try and focus on.
Okay, I had a guest on this podcast recently, and she was an international lawyer and talking about human trafficking, and I was surprised the extent of it worldwide.
It is a global problem.
Yeah.
And, we see it sometimes in international fishing fleets. It manifests itself in all sorts of parts of the globe, parts of industry, parts of the supply chain. That and people smuggling and that sort of servitude is an abhorrent thing, and it occurs globally.
So your investigators would looking out for red flag type situation or a complaint that might come through. How do they initiate an investigation?
Our investigators would ordinarily get referrals.
Right.
So our frontline officers will be the ones who would identify the issue usually, unless it's intelligence-led, in which case we'd obviously take the referral from ACIC or from our intelligence division in Home Affairs. But if you think about a frontline officer who identifies a passenger who they think might be going to be exploited because they find material on their mobile phone that suggests that the reason they're coming to Australia isn't the reason they sit in their visa, or they identify goods in their bag or on their phone. Our field operations, this is where we have officers going around our communities checking on people's visa status, and particularly in high-risk industries. They might identify signs that concern them and refer those to our investigators. So there's a number of ways that we've got a very small investigations capability, comparatively, I'd say. And so they have to be quite discerning over which investigations they actually take on. A lot of it might be intelligence-driven because we get a detection of something in a container examination facility or in our mail examination facilities. So there's a whole lot of ways that referrals to our investigations area get made.
Okay. So when you're talking about out in the field, they do go out and, if there's an industry that they've got concerns about the amount of people that have come over for a temporary visa or that type of thing, they'll physically go out and check.
Yeah, so we have obviously we can't check everybody and everything.
Yeah.
We've got a very finite number of resources to do that, but we do take a risk-based approach. So we get a lot of intelligence from other agencies, including Home Affairs, which is our intelligence
Yep.
area.
That's who you report to, isn't it? Home Affairs.
I don't. I report to the minister as,
Right.
as the commissioner,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
the border force sits within the Department of Home Affairs. If I can put
Okay.
it that way.
Yeah.
Operationally, it's independent,
Yes.
but it sits for finance and employment purposes within the Department of Home Affairs. If I can put it that way. So we've got a very close relationship between ourselves and, say, the secretary, who's the financial authority for the ABF.
Yep.
I'm independent of the secretary, but we work very closely together. We have to, of course, and our intelligence support comes from the Department of Home Affairs.
Okay. Cultures in law enforcement agencies, and we touched on it briefly in part one. You were talking about you're happy, or you're not naive to think that the Australian Border Force is perfect, but I'm interested in, you've worked in so many, and there's not many law enforcement officers that come to this country. It might be in other countries that have worked in so many different sections. What do you think defines a culture of a law enforcement agency, whether it be the Federal Police, New South Wales Police, or Australian Border Force?
First thing I say is tone at the top.
At the top?
Tone at the top.
Yep.
I think is every organisation I've worked in some way, kind of resembles the persona of the CEO. And I think it's really important. I think we underestimate that, particularly in senior positions. When I say senior, I think you've been on this journey yourself, where you get to a certain point, you realise that you're under the spotlight.
Yep.
And everyone's watching you, and the way you behave will define how others behave or work for you.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say.
And if you're willing to let things slide, if you demonstrate you're willing to let things slide, if you show that you're not going to ask the tough questions or follow up on intuition on things, I think the organisation will be like that.
Yeah.
And even if you're a really good leader, I look at an organisation that's close to my heart, the Metropolitan Police, what they've been gone through recently. Things have blown up in their face that were occurring in the organisation that weren't visible on the surface.
Right.
So you can never rest on your laurels. So I think the tone has got to be set from the top, but also you've got to have good governance, good structures, good processes. The other thing I would say for the Border Force, and we can do this probably more easily than the police, is that we don't just grow all of our own.
Yeah.
We do a lot of lateral recruitment,
Okay.
including at very senior levels. So my senior executive team, I've got people who are former private sector, former defence, former police, former customs, former immigration, former public servants. So it's a really diverse team. Diverse in the sense of gender balance as well, but that, of course, I think that's our real strength of the Border Force, that diversity. But at the same time, I have to be conscious, therefore, that it's also a slight weakness because not everybody's got that really deep operational savviness and acumen.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a bit of a conundrum there.
So it is a conundrum, but I think I choose the diversity over the grow our own, because I think we can develop people. We have to do more in this regard in the ABF, but develop people on that lateral move to equip them with the basic knowledge they need around what is C3, how do you deal with an incident that you need to deal with, what are the basic tenets of operational management. I think you can do that.
Right.
So I encourage, we do recruit a lot of our own recruits, but at the same time we like to bring in lateral people as well.
I've always thought, and when I say always, the latter part of my policing career and the broader I worked, whether it was interstate or overseas, I always thought that policing has got to start to be looked at as it's a career, it's a vocation, and your qualifications should be transferable. Like,
Absolutely.
as in, a qualified, I'm not putting us at the pedestal as a doctor, but whether you're a tradesman, doctor, whatever, those skills, they're relevant to New South Wales. You should be able to do a bridging course or whatever, be able to work over in Western Australia or anywhere. What's your thoughts on that? Do you see that as a potential future of policing or law enforcement? More ability to move around?
I would hope so. I think that sort of diversity of career, I can talk from strength here. I've worked in a lot of different organisations, and I would say that I've learnt so much from each of the organisations I've worked in.
Yep.
And benefited from that. And I think that the ABF therefore benefits from that as well. So I would encourage any system that allows senior leaders to become more mobile, to get more experiences, creates that diversity of thinking.
Yeah.
And breaks down those sort of negative sides of policing cultures, generally speaking, very strong and very positive. It's like any either individual or collective attribute, though. Your strength can become your weakness if it's an overextension. Do you know what I mean? And so
Most definitely, how the it's the irony of the strength was the thing that brought you down.
Yeah, it can be if you don't sort of temper it. And so people say you wear your heart on your sleeve. Generally speaking, that's a good thing, mostly. But sometimes it's not.
Balance it out.
Yeah.
But okay, that's all. Thanks for clarifying your thoughts, because I think of all people, you're in a very good position to talk about that. I agree with you about the culture of an organisation. It does starts from the top, but at every level in the structure, it had to be like if I was running a job as a sergeant, if I'm allowing things to happen, then people underneath me go, "Oh, well, that's all right. We can get away with that." And it's a slippery slope, isn't it?
It is. And when I meet our recruits, I always talk to them about don't be a bystander.
Yeah, explain that.
By that, if you see behaviour
Call
or
it out.
stuff going on, you've got to call it out.
Yeah.
And supervisors and managers, of course, should do that, but they don't always do that.
Yeah.
And that allows things to fester. And in fact, it creates toxic working environments where then some people on that team don't want to come to work every day.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Or they feel ostracised. And I just think that any leader in any organisation needs to be conscious of their own behaviour. And if they won't let stuff slide, people will notice that. Whether it's performance, whether it's behaviour, it doesn't matter. If you're a leader who lets stuff slide, it will come back and bite you.
Yeah, I think that's wise advice, and it's not just policing. Sometimes policing, because of the extreme environment we work in, sometimes it blows up in our faces more. But definitely, you need to address problems. And you're a policeman in the 80s. I was a policeman in the 80s.
Yeah.
We know there was a culture that it was a hard field to walk through, isn't it?
It was, and I'm glad that culture doesn't exist today.
Yeah.
For our younger people, because it was tough.
Yeah.
Different times. It's hard to sort of transpose now to then. But we've sort of moved on from that time, and I think today the scrutiny on policing and law enforcement by the courts, by the public, by the media, CCTV, all of that. The best thing leaders can do is call out underperformance and bad behaviour, because that way officers won't be inclined to do those things when they're actually going to be in the spotlight.
Yeah, that makes sense. And they're very much in the spotlight, because I know police in the 80s, it was very a closed shop, and it was things could go wrong, but invariably it wouldn't hit the public, or the public wouldn't be aware of it.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So it's a changed environment. Speaking of changed environments, COVID. It seems like a lifetime ago or a world away, but 2019, around 2019, lockdowns, all sorts of things, and I will talk about the Ruby Princess. But before we talk about the Ruby Princess,
do we have to?
Well, I think it comes out okay. I did a little bit of research on the Ruby Princess. Okay, let's go straight to the Ruby Princess.
Okay.
We won't beat around. That was before the outbreak of COVID in Australia, around time frame. You'd have a clearer memory of it than I would.
A very clear memory.
Yeah.
It's ingrained in my memory, I think. So, we started to lock down the border. We'd never done it before. So, if you might remember, we had the breakout in Wuhan in China. And the first thing the Australian government did was say we need to restrict the movement into Australia from anybody who's been in Wuhan province or China in the last 14 days. That was in about February 2020.
Yep.
March, I think it was, March or April, Ruby Princess occurred, when the cruise ship came into, obviously, Circular Quay.
Circular Quay,
Yeah.
Yep.
And I guess from my point of view, we had a lot of cruise ships coming and going at that time. The cruising, you might remember there was the Diamond Princess had been an issue up in Yokohama Harbour.
Yes.
In Japan. The day before that, we'd had another Princess cruise ship in Melbourne. And what happened on that day was that there was people with flu-like symptoms on the ship, and so Victoria Health asked us to hold everyone on the ship, and they went on the ship and they started doing their testing. It was very well managed. The next day, the Ruby Princess came into New South Wales, into Sydney, and what subsequently happened was I read on the front page of the Australian one morning that the ABF were being blamed, literally blamed, for the disembarkation of all the passengers off that ship, and blamed for deaths and illness, which I found intolerable. So I came out and did a press conference at Parliament House that morning and corrected the record. And then, of course, there was the Royal Commission and all of those things that, what we'd said was found to be accurate. That the key decisions weren't those of the ABF. We're the Customs Service and the Immigration Clearance Service. We don't do biosecurity. We don't have those responsibilities.
You weren't making the decitions, health-based decisions.
No.
You were acting on the decisions that were made. And I do remember that, and it was a time of... it was a strange world for everyone, but there was a lot of finger-pointing and blaming on who allowed this to happen. And I do recall your press conference. I recall that, and I thought, okay, well, you've come up with a reasonable explanation on it. Whose fault was it? So,
yeah, and for me, it wasn't even so much about the whole of the ABF. It was those six. Imagine if you're one of those 6 officers, who boarded ABF officers who boarded that ship, getting blamed for that.
Well, you've just in saying that, Michael, you've just demonstrated to me the type of leader that you are. That it's not about how it impacts on you personally, but it's the people that you've got under your command. So, yeah, I understand where you're coming from. COVID, everyone got started online shopping, and the packages being delivered and all that. That must have been a time of change for you guys as well.
Oh, it was immense. So closing the border.
Yeah.
We'd never done it before. We closed the border in a matter of hours with China, and we had to implement an exemption regime where I was the delegate of the government to approve for Australians to leave Australia or non-Australians to come to Australia. We had to process 1 million applications through that time. There was very personal impacts of all of that on everybody. So people at end of life trying to get to see their family. People trying to come to Australia to be with people doing it tough in the family. There were some really, difficult times.
And how were they processed? Because that is they're hard decisions to make.
Hard decisions where we had to set down criteria for a start, and then we had to hold ourselves to those criteria. We realised that administratively we need to be thorough, and I'd literally be getting phone calls from my chief of staff at the time at midnight, saying, "Hey, Commissioner, we've got some guy here, who blah blah blah, and what do you reckon?" And in the end, though, it became, I had to put with Department of Home Affairs and ABF 300 people on a team to manage all of this. It was a significant endeavour. Affected all of us. Affected me, my family. My wife tried to get an exemption. I couldn't obviously approve her exemption. I had to, I had to hand that responsibility over to.
Sensible, Michael.
I had to hand that responsibility over to the Secretary of the Department of Home Affairs. But the bottom line up front is that, because of the problems in the UK of people getting into a hospital and talking to doctors, she couldn't get there in time, and we ended up saying goodbye to her mother on Skype.
Yeah.
So every family was affected, including mine. It was a hard time. We recognised that. At the same time, we had industry, of course, who were really finding it confusing about all the different rules between the different states. There were different rules about how ports operated in every state, how quarantine was operating in every state. So we had to work really closely with all the state police. Mick Fuller and I were on speed dial almost every day through a lot of this in New South Wales. And then we had to open the border. So when we thought closing the border was hard, mate, I've got to tell you, when it came to opening it, we realised that closing it had been probably a walk in the park in comparison, because reopening it all in a sort of staged way, we had to work very closely with Home Affairs and a whole lot of other government departments on this.
What, as in priority, or you'd lost the...
Just the mechanisms, because every state was moving at different paces again.
Okay.
And the aviation industry was coming back in different ways again, and different industries trying to re-emerge in different ways.
And there was a lot of misinformation, I think, from the general public, like, okay, can you fly to Darwin, or can you fly overseas?
All of that.
What happens if you're overseas? Can you get...
And me getting workforce, so, we'd emptied out the airports of our workforce.
Yep.
We'd have to move them into other areas of operation, and we had issues about vaccination status of officers and all these sorts of things. So, getting workforce reconstituted, moved back into airports to support the airport reopenings, and there was all sorts of processes of testing and and people going into hotel quarantine or not, and it was just really difficult and complicated. But we pulled it off.
It would have been a busy time.
It was a busy time, and I think what I would say is that it showed remarkable for my officers and my organisation. I was so proud of the agility and the
Yeah.
resilience that they all showed, because it seemed to be whatever we threw at them. I mean, we were asked to stand up quarantine facilities on Christmas Island and up in the Northern Territory.
Yeah.
We were not experts at running quarantine, but we had good operational DNA to orchestrate that sort of stuff. So all the things we did through the pandemic weren't things that the Border Force was really stood up to do.
Yeah.
But you're rolling your sleeves up, right? It's all part of Team Australia and getting on with it, and we did that.
I think it's very much part of the psyche of people you'd like to think that are in law enforcement. There's a little bit of robust and flexibility that, this is not what we expected, this is not what we signed up for, but we can understand why we've got to do it.
Yeah, I didn't hear many people saying this is not my job.
Yeah.
And in fact, I was having to send people home. So I remember in Canberra, my senior executives, some of them were out on their feet. And I was literally having to almost give them a red card and say, right, 3 days time out.
Yeah.
Because they were so committed to the cause. They were actually driving themselves into the ground.
Yeah, I've seen that. You would have seen it on homicide investigations, and it gets to the point where people are starting to lose their motor skills, and
Exactly.
they think they're fine. And I've been in that position myself,
Yeah.
and I'm sure you have,
Yeah.
where you get that tap on the shoulder, no, I think it's time you go home. No, I'm fine. And,
Exactly.
yeah,
No, you need to go. And so that was, working blue teams, red teams, and working from home. And I remember doing media interviews from home and all that sort of stuff. It was a time that I wouldn't choose to repeat, though. We learnt a lot about ourselves individually, collectively. I think about how we think about, future crisis and how we might need to manage the border. I think it was instructive in that regard. I talked about being digital. I think the pandemic showed why we need to be digital.
A lot of learning that came from it, which is a good thing. Talking about learning, organised crime. With the borders shut, how did they adapt or adjust their methodology?
They did. It impacted them like all supply chains. They didn't find it. It wasn't a walk in the park. I don't think that the demand for narcotics wasn't as great as it had been. People locked down.
Yeah.
So it definitely impacted on organised crime, and the way the supply chain was operating was different. With far fewer airplanes bringing cargo. Far fewer ships, etc. So it did affect them, and I think the consumption rates, the ACIC wastewater analysis will show the consumption rates went down, but they recovered pretty quick.
Okay. So it's coming in.
It is, and I'd say that I told you earlier on about the uptick in cocaine. So unfortunately, in Australia, as you know, we seem to have an appetite for narcotics, culturally and socially in Australia, and our
And globally, people see this as a place to get. If you get the cocaine here, you're going to be making a handsome profit.
Well, cocaine and meth as well.
Yeah.
So meth's far bigger problem in the sum by volume than cocaine. But while cocaine has increased a lot, but cocaine's increased a lot around the world. Talking to the Dutch and the Europeans, we're just seeing an uptick in production and of cocaine, where it's being all produced in South America. Now we're seeing base cocaine moved into countries for finished production, into cocaine hydrochloride. So there's the production methods and places are changing around cocaine. What worries me is really, I guess, that the consumption in Australia and the amount of money that people are willing to pay for these narcotics in Australia is something that's quite unique to Australia. We do have a different sort of market, I think, than a lot of other parts of the world.
And that probably attracts people, that there's profits to be made. What about bringing drugs in, like we talk sea, but light planes, and from New Guinea?
Well, there was one recently. You might remember that the pilot was arrested by the AFP.
The plane crash or something happened.
That was another one. Yeah. So we've had a couple of instances lately, and if you can think about how many remote airstrips there are across the top end of Australia, north of the tropics, there's a lot, hundreds. Can we monitor them all the time? Of course we can't. And then you think about the range of light aircraft and map that out across the archipelago. So from that, I mean, start the Solomons and move across through West Papua into Indonesia. And you can fly into Australia from a lot of parts of the world. Yeah. And so we have to have eyes to the sky to make sure that all those aircraft coming across that airspace are not itinerant aircraft, black flights as we call them. Yeah. Okay. We have ships on the water that go black. Yep. And we have airplanes in the air that go black. And it's a big task for us to try and track. And we work very closely with the AFP and Defence on this to try and identify and track those flights.
Okay. You've got to keep those borders protected. You talked on cigarettes, and I think people, I know first time I was involved in a investigation relating to cigarettes, it was interstate transport a truckload of cigarettes, avoiding tax for a particular state. I didn't realise how much money was to be made. And I know you've made reference to cigarettes here. With cigarettes now, vapes, is vapes going to be the same type of issue, bringing vapes into the country?
So there is discussion at the moment with the government about the prohibition under the Customs Act of vapes, and that would mean that to bring vapes in, you need a permit, like you do with tobacco now. So that's the first thing. The difference is with vapes, there's no duty, whereas on tobacco, of course, the government levied a lot of duty on a packet of cigarettes. But still, when you, and this is going back centuries now, when you prohibit something coming across the border, you do create an opportunity for smugglers. And so our job in the Border Force is to make sure that we actually make it harder for them to get that stuff across the border. So we're working now on how will we find it, detect it, store it, remove it, etc.
Okay.
And also working through the Department of Health, Commonwealth level, with state and territory health around how best to regulate and police, if you like, the retail sector. Because a lot of tobacco, illicit tobacco and vapes will go under the counter. Illicit tobacco already is going under the counter in retail outlets. So I think we need to work as a country to deal with this. It's about keeping our kids away from addiction, right? I think that's the main thing.
100%.
And so I think we've got to connect together with states and territories and Commonwealth to address this problem. But from the Border Force point of view, we seize. I could take you to our mail facility here in Sydney and Clyde. We are wall to ceiling with tobacco. We are taking, tons of the stuff out of the supply chain every day in sea containers. We might get 10 million cigarettes in one container.
It's a lot, isn't it?
It's a lot if you think about the duty on the cigarette. And then, loose leaf tobacco, there are people trying to produce tobacco in Australia to grow it. It's a big problem. But also what we've seen is, of course, organised crime recognise there's huge profits here.
The money to be made.
So we're seeing a lot of connections now with organised crime who might be importing drugs. They're also involved in illicit tobacco.
Okay.
Standover tactics, it starts then to become an issue for local police because you've got, standover tactics and people threatening each other and violence spilling onto the streets as well, potentially, over tobacco. Yeah. And we've seen that recently in Melbourne. So it's another big challenge for us. By volume, I'd say tobacco is the biggest challenge for us. The sheer amount that's coming in.
I see with ABF, there's times where firearms importation inquiries, they're importing bits and pieces of a firearm that obviously you get it all here. You put the firearm together. Is that something that's you focus on as well? Yeah,
very much. Silencers, firearm parts, and of course now we've got 3D printing as well, which is another challenge. That, sort of bypasses, if you like, our border controls. But we certainly detect and seize a lot of firearms. We regulate the import of firearms, so we work with the industry quite closely. But you're right, it's rare we find like a handgun or a rifle or something like that being imported illegally in full. It'd be more firearms parts, which is more difficult. And again, in the future, I would say this is where technology comes in because, AI, you would think would be, with 3D scanning sort of technology in the future, should be able to identify all those different parts that could be used to make up a firearm.
Yeah. So the good news is we'll get through airports quicker, but the bad news is for people that were that way inclined, they won't be able to bring through anything illegally.
I think the future
utopia.
Is. Yep, that's utopia. That's like, where we're screening things at speed and scale, using technologies, using AI, screening containers as they come off a ship, screening crates as they come off an aeroplane, passengers pre-cleared before they arrive, bags as well.
Yep.
And we can achieve all of that, but it requires a bit of investment between industry and government over a number of years in the border, in the system that is the border.
Okay. Do you have your people have a lot of court time? Investigators, do they end up in court a lot? Contested matters?
Yes, we do. A lot of contested matters. We also, we apply a lot of infringements that are in sort of the administrative side of law.
Yeah.
Our investigators do end up in a lot of contested matters, and we do a lot of work with the AFP and state police and ACIC in that as well. So we end up in a lot of joint task forces.
I do see that, and in my research on ABF, there's a lot of joint task force, isn't there? So you're working with a lot of different agencies.
We do. I try and stick in our lane if we can, as much as we can. But you think about the way crime works. In terms of trusted insiders, I actually think we work very closely with the police. But if you think about this, we can take people's licences away. We can actually put them out of business in some cases. So our powers on the Customs Act can in sometimes have a better disruptive effect
Most
than a
definitely.
long-term police investigation, which takes a lot of surveillance and a lot of effort, really, to lock up maybe some of the sort of, as we call bunnies, some of the lower level sort of players. So we're working very closely with the AFP and State and Territory Police around, I try and stick in our lane to use our customs powers in that case. I think we can, working with industry, I think we can actually squeeze a lot of these rogue players out of the system.
Yep.
And we're about 100 companies that we're currently looking at, and with some of those we're squeezing them pretty hard. And with others, even recently I met with a multinational company. I won't name them on here, but they operate across a lot of the world, and their senior executives flew from another country to meet with me because I was getting fed up.
Right.
And they've given me a lot of commitments to improve their game here in Australia, and I believe that they will do that. And we're working with them now.
Okay, well, that's a good approach.
Yeah, and it's all about making our border more hostile to this sort of infiltration. So yes, we do work with them in a lot of cases, but the point earlier on, my investigators are really quite a scarce resource.
Yeah.
So I prefer they did our investigations than just joined a police task force for the sake of it. Now, if that police task force is going to target an issue that we're interested in too, happy days. Work with them all day long.
So a multidisciplined task force, and you bring the skills in that they, the AFP or one of the state police might not necessarily have. Do you get, I think you mentioned that you've got officers overseas?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Can you say? I won't know. Just how many? Like,
well, we've got about 15 countries covered. So we've got three kinds, I suppose. Firstly, airline liaison officers.
Yep.
They work in a number of other airports around the globe where people fly to Australia from.
So they're dealing with issues that if someone's coming from that country or come from Australia, they're there on the ground to resolve.
Working with the airline, checking people, working either airside or passenger side.
Yep.
And they offload about 300 people a year who don't get on aeroplanes, and that was a situation earlier on, saves our country a lot of money. They link in, by the way, with our Border Operations Centre, which is 24/7, 365. Then we have a number of officers who are posted for 3-year cycles into a number of countries around the world.
Yeah.
So you would expect, sort of Europe, North America, London,
where there's high traffic,
Jakarta, Malaysia, Japan.
Yeah.
And more recently, we're outposting 10 of our officers into the South Pacific. So we're just in the process of doing that now. So the Solomon Islands, Kiribati, PNG, Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa.
Are you turning this into an advertisement for? I'm thinking of applying.
Well, so we have to work internationally.
Yeah.
To our border, if you think about the minute that somebody decides to travel to Australia, or decides to send goods to Australia, that's where our border starts.
Yeah. In
many ways. So it's a continuum. It's not just the physical line on the map, as I said earlier on. Protecting our border starts offshore.
Well, and you're proactive in your approach by having them offshore.
Yeah,
too,
exactly.
I would imagine. I see that you're still passionate about the work that you've been doing, and you've been doing it for a long time, and you've still retained your sense of humour, so you've survived. But would you recommend it to people?
Highly. I mean, I looked back through my career, some of the defining moments. We've talked about some of them. MH17, I was the op commander for MH17. I was at the AFP.
Sorry, that's one I did want to talk about just before we'll get back to that. The plane that was shot down.
Yeah, Ukraine. I was at the Federal Police at the time, and I was the op commander, the operational commander for the first sort of couple of months of that operation. And none of us got any sleep for sort of 2 months. It was, you could imagine, airplanes shot out the sky over eastern Ukraine, over a battlefield where there was ongoing, military combat activity between the Ukrainian army and the Russian separatists. It left the Netherlands, so there was a lot of Dutch passengers, a lot of Australian passengers, a lot of Malaysian passengers, and others, English, but they're the main sort of people and bodies falling out of the sky. So we had to get into the battlefield, recover bodies and evidence. I remember putting AFP officers onto an aeroplane to Europe, to a Singapore Airlines flight, not knowing where they were going to go.
Yeah.
And eventually we got them into eastern Ukraine with the immense support from the world-class Australian Defence Force. And it had never been done before. There was no script. the risks were sometimes, difficult to imagine. And
well, you're basically going into a hostile environment. Very diplomatically sensitive for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, and we had officers. You could hear in the background, artillery fire in the background and all of that. So it was unprecedented, and that was one of those moments where, because when Kiev came awake, we were supposed to be going to bed, so we had to, adjust our sleeping hours.
Yeah.
And I was running the ICC in the bunker here in Canberra, but I remember that was one of those moments where I thought, yep, this is what I was put on this earth to do.
Okay.
The family liaison team were immense. You'd imagine back here in Australia, we had to liaise with all those family members, keep them up to date. And I remember going with the Assistant Minister to Tullamarine when the first military jet came back with the first Australian bodies, and, it was really heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
Obviously for the families, but just to be there and be part of it was heart-wrenching. And again, it's one of those moments where you think, career in law enforcement? Yep, you bet. That's what we're here to do, to work for our community. And you could see just that support from the AFP at the time and from the government meant so much for those families.
So that's situations like that, those sacrifices you make as individuals become worth it when you get job satisfaction.
Absolutely
through
right.
that by helping people. Because I can only imagine how those families would have felt, wondering what's going on, and with you guys having a look at it, primarily, I would imagine to be able to explain to them what's gone on.
Exactly
and
right.
making sure that things were done as best they could be in the circumstances.
And we had to get into the whole, forensic process in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
Identification and all of that. It was not an element almost of the AFP wasn't touched by that. We spent, I can't remember how much money in the first 6 weeks. I had no authority to spend money. We spent a fortune.
Yeah.
Just getting officers up there and getting the job done. And I've got to say again, world class. I mean, the AFP were brilliant. The partners were brilliant. ADF were just world class as a partner in that. So we're proud of that organisation and the support they gave us.
Oh, that's interesting, and that's the diversity of a policing career. I interrupted you with policing. Would you recommend it to people?
I wouldn't. I'd recommend the Australian Border Force too, which is
I was going to let you choose. I think I'd already predetermined the answer. A, New South Wales Police. B, AFP or Australia. Yeah.
I'd recommend them all. I think that anybody who's thinking of a career in law enforcement, think expansively. I think when I joined, the idea was you join the Metropolitan Police as an 18-year-old and retire as a 48-year-old.
Yes.
And there was no idea that you'd move outside. I've worked in 5 organisations and I've enjoyed all 5 of them immensely. And so I think people should think about the variety, the diversity, and the skills are transferable, immensely transferable, not just within law enforcement, but to move beyond that at some point. So I think it's fine to come into law enforcement, go in the private sector and come back again, or go into other parts of public service and come back again. I'd encourage people to think about it though, because the sense of reward is what really counts, I think. The sense that you're making a difference and doing something good for our community and our country.
Yeah, and when you look back at your career, if you feel that you've made a difference, that's more rewarding than a lot of things that you could be doing that might be easier, but perhaps don't give you the job satisfaction. But
couldn't agree more. I remember when I came into this job, somebody said to me, "It's fantastic, Mike, but not every day's going to be a good day, is it?" And never a truer word spoken. But but the good days and the good moments certainly outweigh the bad ones.
And every day can be different too.
You've got it.
That's the thing.
Yeah.
You're not turning up every day knowing what's going to happen. You have no idea what's going to happen when you walk in the door at work each day.
Absolutely right.
So you'd recommend it, but you can be Australian Border Force. Is that your first pick?
Oh, of course it is. I'm the Commissioner of the Australian Border Force, and I would say within the Border Force, we can offer things that a lot of policing organisations can't offer. And so, the variety that we offer, we are not a police force. We're a law enforcement agency, but we work with industry. We're as much about our economy and supporting industry as we are in regulating it and enforcing those laws. So it's a very different sort of organisation. We have 600 of our officers at sea. Patrolling 8.2 million square kilometres of ocean around our beautiful country.
So of the 5,500 or so members you got, 600 are out at sea.
Yeah, exactly right. And you think about people who work in the Torres Strait. Most Australians haven't been there. I have, and it's absolutely stunning. So you get to work in all sorts of, places, Port Hedland, the Pilbara,
I've spent a lot of time up at Port Hedland and Pilbara around there. It's beautiful. Isn't
It is gorgeous, yeah. So it's a really, unique organisation. But then there are gateways into and from general law enforcement policing with the ABF because there's a lot of similarities.
Yeah.
But we're not the police, and we do recruit as well from other areas of public service, military, private sector as well. So, we're quite a diverse organisation.
Well, look, I think I've really enjoyed the chat, and it's given me an understanding of what the Australian Border Force does. But I hope listeners really appreciate the diversity of the work that comes across and the interesting stories that you have. And look, you seem so happy.
No, I am.
Aren't you meant to be stressed and tired? 40 years in policing and law enforcement, and look at you, you've still got a smile on your face.
Maybe that's what I've learnt to be.
Yeah, it's a good way of approaching it.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much for taking the time on coming on I Catch Killers. I've really enjoyed
Thank
the
you,
chat.
Garrett. It's been my pleasure.
And can I just say, and this is genuine, and thanks for the service that you've given to the community, both here and overseas. So thank you.
Thanks, mate. Really appreciate it.
Cheers. I've been in law enforcement for a long time. I thought I had an understanding of all the work that Australian Border Force does, but the Commissioner, Michael Outram, really gave us an in-depth understanding of the diverse range of work that Australian Border Force carry out. To be able to actually sit down and speak to a Commissioner of a large law enforcement agency on the podcast was a real treat for me. I got to say, I think he would make a great boss. He seems to have the right attitude. He's done policing from the grassroots level up and has a really interesting outlook. And the thing that I took away from that, he's got a positive outlook too. He's still got a smile on his face. 40 years in law enforcement. You don't see that very often, but that's someone that's enjoying his job, and no doubt is very good at it.